Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm exhausted listening to it. So I have about 5 minutes now to actually talk to you, and then we'll go to the Q&A. I'm delighted to be here for a variety of reasons. I first came to Malaysia in the 1970s, and having studied Islam and done a PhD, in those days, in most programs, you majored in either Middle East, or then you major maybe in Turkey or in Iran, and very few people and very little coverage of Southeast Asia. So when I came in the 70s, it was actually to go here into Indonesia, and oh, thank you very much. I visited IIUM in its old campus, and I was I think I just finished my degree. So, I mean, I was unknown by anybody, and they had me speak, and a few people showed up the first day, and then it got larger and larger. They invited me back every day, and then finally we had a full auditorium. And it was very interesting in that no matter what I talked about, and I won't go through this whole story, but no matter what I talked about, somebody would eventually raise their hand and ask me if I understood Islam so well, why wasn't I a Muslim? The question has also been raised, as you said, for about 20 years. Usually it's raised more like, he hasn't come out yet. You know, we're waiting for it. I've never told this story publicly, but I'm going to tell it now. I was at a private meeting in the Gulf that was the Gallup ran, and I was on the board of Gallup for that center. And we had diplomats from Europe, we had academics, we had Muslims and non-Muslims. And I'd spoken, and we had the last panel, and I was the last person, and I was tired. And so I decided that I really didn't want to give another talk. So what I said was that here we were in a meeting, I knew everything was off the record, I knew I could trust people, and I would now address a question that many people have wondered about. And then I looked down very seriously and said, yes, it's true. I do dye my hair. And the young Muslims were all laughing. And after it, they said to me, they could hear the older Muslim going, mashallah, mashallah, waiting for those words to come out. The other people thought I was crazy, obviously, the Westerners, like, why is he even into this topic? But I'm glad to be back here. And what I'd like to talk about today is trying to understand the relations between the Muslim world and the West. In order to understand that, one needs to briefly have a sense of where we've come from. I don't mean historically, this is not going to be long. But the fact is that most of you would probably be unaware of the fact that in the 1960s and 1970s, Islam was invisible in America and Europe, generally speaking. In America, it was not taught in any of the schools. A few of the top universities had, a professor, in Islamic studies. There were really very few major programs. There was no major program to study Islam, let's say, within a religion department. So people who did were historians who dealt with it. Because of the notion of modernization and development in those days, which was that modernization and development meant the westernization and secularization, as a consequence of that, it meant that religion was actually past. So it was in the past, but it wasn't significant in the present. And in fact, the idea was over time, it would disappear. Professional organizations, the American Academy of Religion, the Middle East Studies Association, had very little, in those days, coverage. In fact, the AAR, American Academy of Religion, which is the largest professional academy in the world, dealing with the religions of the world, had no section on Islam. It was primarily sections on Catholicism, Protestantism, scripture within those traditions, and Judaism. The Middle East Studies Association did very little, again, because if you had certainly modern social scientists, for modern social scientists, you didn't need to do anything about Islam except to look at something in the past. A very famous scholar, an excellent scholar on Iran, James Bill, who studied at Princeton, once said to me that the only time he dealt with Islam was looking in the past. So it only was when he went on to do his research for his dissertation that he discovered how alive Islam was in society and in various sectors of society. Okay? The media did not cover Islam and Muslims. I did a dialogue show, yes, in Boston with an imam and a rabbi, and that would be at a very convenient time. It would be shown on television on Sunday at 6 a.m. And the only reason the show was done was that the stations were required to do certain, coverage of programs. And so they decided, well, they would do religion, but it would always be at 6 a.m. when basically very few people looked at it. So then what did the encounter take place for many people in terms of the contemporary world? It occurred with the Iranian Revolution. And what that meant was, in terms of Muslim-West relations, it meant that very often in America and in Europe, for citizens who knew nothing about Islam, that was their engagement. That told them what Islam and Muslims were like. And of course, what that meant was seeing people shout death to America. It meant the overthrow of what was seen as a powerful Shah, the second largest army in the military in the Middle East, second to Israel, who had the right support governments, the U.S., the UK, France, and overthrown by an Ayatollah in his 70s, white beard. And I always would say to people when I spoke, picture the Shah of Iran, and then picture the Ayatollah Khomeini, put two pictures up there. The idea that Khomeini would somehow trump the Shah in a revolution in which the revolutionaries did not engage in violence. It was only the military that did, and that the Shah would then leave, and that this Ayatollah, who had lived in exile for some 20 years and was at that time in a suburb of Virginia, would actually be the leader of it and come back, would seem incredible. And then the possibility of that spreading then became the concern and the great fear. Analogously, I would say the Arab Spring became a concern with great fear for many of the authoritarian regimes. So it wasn't just judged in terms of Egypt and Tunisia, but for many of the countries in the Gulf, it wasn't that they expected those movements and Nahda and the Muslim Brotherhood to come. Rather, it was that the idea and the success would stir up situations within a country. And so you would have this kind of tsunami wave of democracy. You have to have that and hold that in your mind. And then think about how during that period, one began to see the assassination of Anwar Sadat. We didn't begin to see it, it happened. One then had hijackings, attacks on embassies, and then 9/11 came. 9/11 was a peak experience. It's hard to exaggerate the impact of 9/11 in the United States. I traveled, I did not go overseas, but rather spent my time traveling across America. And wherever you went in America, big cities, rural cities, etc., you could see American flags. You could see meetings and people discussing what had happened. A major program came into being, which actually dealt with the theme America held hostage, not Americans held hostage, but America held hostage. So it was a very extraordinarily, sorry, I meant to, that actually happened with the Iranian Revolution. I am very tired after these 4 days. But with regard to the 9/11 attacks, the extent to which it occurred was to then picture for Americans who had seen the Iranian Revolution, for the older generation, and also now experience 9/11. How would they see the relationship between Islam and the West? How would they see Muslims? Then you move from Al-Qaeda and the fear that, again, Al-Qaeda would sweep, the Middle East, that the youth in particular would follow. And then you move to ISIS. And ISIS becomes, from my point of view, a kind of double threat, because ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda, mastered public relations, effective public relations, in a nasty and negative way, i.e., if you want attention, you get the internet and you get really great films, great in the sense that appeal to people, show a kind of triumphant possibility, an exciting life, demonstrate with that initial spread of ISIS, which was incredible in terms of the kind of territory that it was taking. ISIS therefore drew recruits not only from the Muslim world, but as we know, from the West. And so then it became, it's for some people unimaginable. Why would people from various countries in Europe, for example, go there? And why would it be, yes, a lot of people who were felt alienated within their society, had identity issues, saw in their eyes what was going on in the Muslim world and the role that the West, was playing, but also some who were well-educated and one would have thought would have been content with where they were. But ISIS also used one other thing, which we know, beheading people. And the interesting thing is, it did it intensively and then stopped, which shows that it wasn't as if this was the natural principle that they had. The idea was to get the kind of attention that they got and to send, with that kind of barbaric action, you're going to get intensive media coverage. That media coverage is meant to terrify some, but attract others. And, when you look at the number of people that were executed after the French Revolution and the years after, it was a terrible number that ISIS did. But you were talking, if I remember correctly, looking this up on the internet, something like 11,000 people. And you actually have a country in the Muslim world, which in fact, in a single year, beheaded more than ISIS did. Okay, so it's seeing that kind of dynamic and its impact on Muslim-West relations. On the other hand, within the Muslim world, and here I don't mean in terms of extremists, but within the mainstream Muslim world, there is, of course, the remembrance of colonialism, neo-colonialism, post-colonialism, the invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq, and it being done in the name of democracy. The fact that these events were occurring and its impact could then be documented in the Gallup World polls that we did. The Gallup World polls basically were polls done for about 5 or 6 years, covering, I forget now, but most of the countries in the world. Okay, and they initially, what they were about, they called them well-being polls. So in other words, they would ask people, how do you see your life? What do you think of your government? What do you think of the economy? How do you feel about religion? Is it important to you or not, etc. But within that, some 35 or 40 Muslim countries, okay, had data that was pulled out and had additional questions that were asked that would intersect with the culture. So, for example, what do you think about Sharia? What role should Sharia play? How do you feel about the West? Okay, and what one saw at the time was that the vast majority of Muslims, and that's why the data was important, you had data that demonstrated that the vast majority of Muslims did not simply hate the West, because the idea after 9/11 was they hate who we are, they hate our democracy, our freedoms, etc. Well, the vast majority of Muslims said what they wanted for themselves and what they admired in the West was good governance, the ability to pick leaders, freedom of religion, equality of citizenship, and an end to corruption, and dignity. Okay, dignity. Dignity became the significant word used during the Arab Spring. Often it wasn't reported that way, but in fact it was what those who were taking to the streets, how they saw it. They called, in fact, their quest a dignity revolution. For them, dignity meant respect and freedom. Sorry, I don't know what it is. It must be when you get older, some people, they get this dry mouth. And if I don't do this, my mouth just goes like this, and then I can't articulate. So, because I try sometimes not to do that. But what I'm trying to say is there's a certain reality out there. And in terms of understanding Muslim-West relations, the other kind of questions that we had with Gallup, and by the way, this also comes out in Pew, P-E-W, Pew polls, Muslims were asked, well, then what don't you like about the West? Or, what are your concerns about the West? Think about this then again in terms of Muslim-West relations. The first things that come out are Islam and Muslims are not respected. Well, why would they say that? They would say it because everything from the Danish cartoons, the characterization of Islam itself, not just extremism, as a violent religion, and therefore the brushstroking of most Muslims. The fact that, I use this as a comparative, the Defense Department in the U.S. did what it should do, that is, be aware of and make public every American who was killed, and also all of those who were injured in the military, but never kept statistics when they were asked, never had statistics on the Iraqis who were killed, which were enormous numbers, and yet you could have the Secretary of Defense, when independent studies were done by, let's say, professors at Johns Hopkins or whatever, that talked about hundreds of thousands of people, who'd been impacted, you could have the Secretary of Defense say those numbers are inflated, they're not true. So, but if you don't keep numbers, then how do you know that they're inflated or not true? The other thing that people complained about was, or they had concerns, was that they basically said, on the one hand, they wanted democracy and they wanted closer relations with the West, but they didn't believe that, in fact, Western countries that said they believed self-determination and democracy would or had promoted it in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. And indeed, President Bush in his second term indicated that and said that he himself in his first term had not done that, and that presidents before him, whether Republican or Democrat, had not promoted. There was, in fact, a rumor that when Secretary Baker, under the first President Bush, went to the Middle East in one of his last trips, and Baker was known as somebody who was very attuned and sensitive to the Palestinian issue and the Middle East, supposedly he had like 5 major points he was going to make. And so some of the people at State kidded and said it was the 5 pillars with regard to Islam in the Middle East. But that when the plane landed, the 5th pillar was dropped, the promotion of democracy. And yet the feeling was democracy was promoted in all other countries, including the countries with the fall of the Soviet Union, countries that had been atheists, lived under a total and raised and lived within that sort of culture of domination, yet it was believed that they could democratize, but not these other countries. And a good reason for that, good, not a moral judgment, but there's a reason for that, among other things, was the sense that what authoritarian governments in the Middle East would say, and what policymakers too often in the West would buy, is that we're the only game in town that you can trust. We can provide stability and security, which is important to you and to us. And if not us, then who? It will be these Islamists. They would always say that they're not representative. The people would never vote for them, but they'd never hold elections. So that was the old wisdom. And I'll come back to that in a little while. Okay. So as we look at today's world, and as we look at Muslim-West relations, what are the issues and what do we see? Today's world is a world of globalization of communications, globalization of media, globalization of travel, globalization of information. And it's a world of, in recent decades, immigration, significant immigration. We're not just talking about the immigration issue now. It's a world in which enormous numbers of people have immigrated, and particularly Muslims. I forget now the exact statistic, but it is a remarkable statistic, the number of Muslims who have migrated to other countries. It's a time in which, because of that immigration, it's also been a time for a transformation in many countries in the West. countries that were initially described as Protestant, Catholic, and Jew suddenly had Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus. In America, much of that happened in significant ways in terms of those three faiths that I mentioned from the 60s on. You had Muslims coming before, but in terms of this, really significant. Because I can tell you, as somebody who was raised in New York, or as I like to say, cosmopolitan New York, and the best part of New York, which is Brooklyn. But as that person, I never heard of or saw a mosque. I never heard of Islam. It wasn't on my radar at all. And if there, then what? In those days, there were maybe two mosques that people were aware of, and actually most people weren't. The Mosque of Boston, which wasn't in Boston, it was in Quincy, and a mosque in Iowa. Today, to see the transformation, you can go to any state, most areas and states, and you have mosques or Islamic centers, as well as incredible Hindu temples, etc. Okay. But for many, with the exception of the U.S., which is a country of immigrants, for Europe, for Europeans, what did it really mean? If you were a European in much of Europe, and certainly in Northern Europe, but other parts of Europe, basically, to be whatever you were, to be Danish, to be a Swede, was basically to be born in a country that had a Swedish or Danish history, and that history was made by people who were white and who spoke one language, I mean, you know, the Danish language, and a sense of, therefore, a Danish history and culture. So to be a Dane was all of that and Danish customs. Now when you have immigrants coming in, okay, and depending on where they're coming from, you have the browning of that society. I remember being in the UK doing a set of lectures, and I went to dinner, and I was sitting there, and I could hear this person with a very high-pitched voice, a posh British accent, having an animated conversation. I turned around at a certain point, and he was about 6'3", black, probably from Africa, but with a British accent, almost what looked like dreadlocks. And I thought to myself, I wonder how everybody else in the restaurant, if they're older people, are feeling. Not just because the one person was there, but because you're seeing significant numbers. It's said in America, for example, that by the year 2050, the majority of Americans will not be white. Now, one of the reasons why you have very conservative Americans nervous, let alone very militant white nationalists, is, you know, our, quote, white nation, you know, is now going to be dominated by people, not just the idea of people of other colors, but that people who are seen as different, you know, different in terms of their looks, different in terms of, for some, their languages, if they're the immigrants, different in terms of their religion, different in terms of their culture and many of their cultural practices. We know that Macron of France has attempted now to, said that he's going to address all of this, of course, by creating a French Islam, which is a kind of interesting contradiction in terms. Okay, so part of the challenge then that I would say, and this is the second part of my talk, which I'll try to be brief with, the challenge today, both in the Muslim world and the West, both areas are challenged in terms of pluralism. I believe that pluralism is the challenge of the 21st century. And when I did a book on Islamophobia, it was Islamophobia and pluralism in the 21st century. But it's not just about Islamophobia. It's not just about discrimination against Muslims in the West. It's that the test for many countries in the world, not just the Muslim world, but within that, the Muslim world, and the test for the West is political pluralism and religious pluralism. In the West, you can see that challenge because we have if you see the rise of the right, the far right, in reaction to immigrants in general and Muslims in particular, okay? We see the rise of that far right, both in terms of politics, political parties, and what they stand for, but also the extent to which, over time, some of the attitudes of these right-wing groups have actually gotten into mainstream British politics and mainstream French politics, and certainly the Netherlands. Okay. And so what you then have is not just a, if you will, the ability to say, well, these aren't mainstream parties anymore. The fact is that in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, these parties are players. And in some cases, they came in second, and people would say, see, it shows you, I mean, we shouldn't have worried so much. If they come in second, it means being second. It's like in a race. You know, you come in first and somebody comes in second, even if the person who's first it's not super close, but quite close. Times change, issues occur, governments fall, and Le Pen could come to power. And Geert Wilders could come to power. A Geert Wilders that has said for some time that compared the Quran to Mein Kampf, talked about closing down mosques, talked about deporting people, if not, you know, that the ideal would be to deport, quote, not quote, but deport them all. And I would note that he also was invited and came at the time of the Republican convention to the United States to speak, and to speak to some who were at that convention. So there's a political pluralism, on the other hand, that exists within countries. The Arab Spring represents that. The challenge of the Arab Spring, again, to governments that are authoritarian, or as about as close to authoritarian as you could, you know, imagine. And I remember, I just want to ask, how many of you were at the talk I gave yesterday? Hopefully not any of you. Great. Okay, and if you were, keep your hands down so you don't inhibit me. Okay. But I remember talking to a young man, and probably in his 30s, very bright, was a journalist, wrote, actually he was a descendant of Hassan al-Banna, but not a member of the Brotherhood. His father, even his father was not a member of the Brotherhood. He is now living in sort of exile, if you will, outside the country. But we were talking about the situation in Egypt, and he said, you know, a lot of people don't appreciate from outside the experience of Egyptian young people. And this fellow was probably in his 30s. He said, just think about the fact that for most young people in Egypt, the only president that they've known and the only reality with regard to what politics is, what political culture is, okay, is the Mubarak regime. And it came home even more closely to me when in the States, somebody, I forget what instance, they had Mubarak, and then next to that, all the presidents of the United States that he had interacted with. And that's where Americans really could get a message, because there were so many of the presidents, you know. You couldn't believe that he could have matched them. But of course, if you've been in for 30 plus years, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, okay, that creates a reality. And by the way, I will probably want to unpack it now, but that creates also a problem. If you are raised in a political culture of authoritarianism, even if you embrace getting rid of authoritarianism, you don't have or don't know what the culture of democratization is. You know you've succeeded, but you don't know what it really means. For example, one of the things you often see is that people don't understand that part of democratization is that you may not like the opposition, but it doesn't mean that you throw them in jail. It doesn't mean that you say, well, now's my turn. Now I'm in, I think you're a threat, so I'm going to, do this stuff to you. So with the Arab Spring, if you take a look at it, particularly, I'll just focus on Egypt and Tunisia. You see then this call for the freedoms and good governance. You see also the fact that the people who called for it never expected that the governments were toppled. So they weren't even prepared at that point. They were frustrated. They took to the street. They wanted to make their point of view. But then what happens after that? We ran a conference, we meaning the center that I'm in Istanbul with a center in Turkey. And we invited the leadership and the youth from Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Libya, and Syria. However different the discussions went, what really emerged very clearly was that everybody was concerned about two things. One, the deep state. The deep state meaning, can you really have a new government when, in fact, the institutions of the state, many of them, military, police, judiciary, okay, when they're still those that were appointed by the former regime, and they're still in power. And we see, if you look at Egypt in particular, that deep state became really serious. All of those units. The president could suggest something, the judges, the judiciary would throw it out, or the military would throw it out. Tunisia, the military stayed in the barracks. But when it came to the playing out in other areas, you had a similar problem. Where you see a tension between, if you will, the Muslims or the Muslim world and the West, in terms of this particular portion of the Muslim world, is the reaction to the Arab Spring in the West. That is, the initial reaction in the U.S. and the EU, but particularly in the U.S., was, in effect, not a clear reaction. In the early period, for a couple of weeks, you might have the president saying, it would go back and forth, but the president saying, we respect the rights of people. And then maybe have the Secretary of State, again, or vice versa, say, Mr. Mubarak is a longtime ally. Finally, the change was accepted. But was it really accepted? And that was the second part of the concern in Istanbul. Because the second part of the concern was to say, and will now, if we have free and fair elections, we pick a party or someone who the West is uncomfortable with, you know, will, quote, they allow it, or will they recognize it? Now, even when the U.S. accepted it, I remember the leadership, actually Rashid Ghannouchi, when he came to the U.S., now his party elected, etc., and spoke with a particular government official who was, they had a very good conversation, very open, now they were meeting, but then at a certain point in the conversation, the person said, and, you know, we can have good relations, and of course, you know, we would expect and want to know what your policy is on women, on Israel, and that Ghannouchi was in a position to have to say, wait a second, you know, if we're really equals coming together, then we don't have this sense, you know, that you're going to hold up the bar and I have to meet that bar. But what then happened when the Arab Spring turned into an Arab winter? First of all, because the politics or the culture of democracy did not exist in Egypt, many in Egypt who, yes, demonstrated, wanted to see the government go, did not say, and it's going to go when the next elections occur. And elections were coming up fairly soon. They did not. And so you had a cross-section of people, and a large number, who did take to the streets, and you had a coup. What was the reaction of the EU and the United States? Expression of concern, especially when things got out of hand, but by and large, Obama himself, who had been very good on issues of democracy and certainly issues of Islam, both in his Cairo speech and in other ways, never recognized that it was a coup, would not say it was a coup. The EU didn't go that far, but neither really was ready to go down the line in responding and rejecting what happened, because within a month or two, things returned pretty much to normal. In the U.S., the government went about doing what occurred before, and that is every year giving a significant subsidy to Egypt. And in many other ways, recognizing that this was the new government and the way to go forward. Rather than the idea that you hold to that and that more and more pressure is brought in that situation. And that in doing that, you are also careful to make clear that you will do everything you can with regard to the IMF, etc., for there not to be, you know, a healthy relationship. What do we mean in terms of the notion of religious pluralism in Muslim-West relations? Well, we need to be really concerned about the plight of Christians in the Middle East and what has happened to Christians and in these last years. That is, Christians in Iraq, Christians in Syria, Christians in the Holy Land. We need to be as concerned about that as we are about the situation of Muslims, whether it's victims in wars that we may not agree with, and certainly when it comes to the rise of Islamophobia. Islamophobia has, in the United States and in EU, reached epidemic proportions in the sense that it is a social cancer, and it, by 2015, had actually begun to peak as a social cancer, so much so that people would say it has become normalized. Or as a member of the parliament, a Muslim member of the parliament, who eventually resigned over the British policy with regard to Israel, Baroness Warsi, said, it's reached dinner table acceptance. In other words, you can talk Islamophobically about Islam and Muslims at a dinner table, and nobody sees that as a problem. Whereas anti-Semitism, and certainly in recent years, racism, in the sense of in terms of African Americans, is no longer acceptable. How do we address that? Well, one of the ways that we address it is we address the causes. And what are the causes? Well, the causes are multiple. They can be political and socioeconomic, but certainly it's very much connected to media and media coverage. And I will finish this up in about 5 or 10 minutes, Middle East time. If you look at media, for those of you that are students, if you interested in following this up, look up media, M-E-D-I-A, Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. Otherwise, you can just believe the statistics I'm giving you. Media Tenor did a study from 2001 to 2011. 975,000. I repeat again, 975,000 pieces of media. 2001, 2011. And looked and said, where is Islam and where are Muslims in this? It found that in 2001, 2% of the coverage was on extremism and violence and terrorism, 0.1% on the vast majority of Muslims, Muslim countries, context, etc. 2011, the 2% goes to 25%. The coverage of mainstream context, mainstream Muslims, remains at 0.1%. Incredible disparity, especially if you have Americans and Europeans whose experience with Muslims is not personal and know nothing about the faith. If your source of news and who people are, etc., if you're restricted to that kind of coverage. 2015, it gets worse. Among the things in 2015 is looking at media coverage in the US, UK, and Britain. 8 out of 10 stories cover extremism and terrorism. And even a significant number of stories, you have a lot of mainstream coverage. I mean, you have mainstream coverage, not necessarily a lot, but you have mainstream coverage, but even there, some of that mainstream coverage actually is on the negative side. There's no great emphasis on key Muslim, when you talk about, well, who are Muslims in terms of, the public square or in significant ways. You're not talking about where you've got, Muslims who have accomplished this or that, very publicly. The this or that you're covering of Muslims are terrorist, extremist, etc. They predominate. The second thing that reinforces it is social media. And I would argue that in the last decade, social media actually is far more influential than mainstream media. In social media, studies done by the Center for American Progress and also CARE, and the studies were based on income tax returns as they looked at the situation, found that foundations and individuals gave more than $200 million during a 10-year period to authors and to websites that were seen as anti-Muslim. In other words, not just to, let's say, websites that were called Jihad Watch or whatever, but also to kind of far-right, neoconservative websites, which were that in terms of domestic policy, but also were anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim. So you've got a very powerful force. On the other hand, when you're trying to talk about a West dealing with the Muslim world, you see the impact of extremism and terrorism. It may not be global, but it is global geographically. It may not be overwhelming, but in some ways it is overwhelming if you happen to live in Paris or in Belgium or in, you know, and again, that's both the evil genius, actually, of ISIS versus Al-Qaeda. I mean, ISIS definitely targeted Western countries and did it in a way in which it wasn't just that you had a single shot. It could come back again. And so their message was that you're, in a sense, you're always vulnerable to what could happen. So where do we really go from here? I think that one of the things that we have to realize as we go from here is that there needs to be two new paradigms. One is the recognition of multiple modernities, and I'll talk about that very briefly as I end. And the other is pluralism. The fact is today, unlike in the past, when the model for modernity or modernizing was a single model, the idea being that what one understood in terms of the institutions for modernization and the values, etc., were going to be based on the West. Okay. Adapted, maybe, but based on the West. So we had reforms in education, which meant traditional education was replaced by modern education. Political institutions that happened. But embedded in that was this notion, again, that it meant the westernization and secularization of society. Multiple modernities basically says that societies adapt in their own ways. They are influenced. They can borrow from others, but that, in fact, societies will choose to be modern in ways that also respond to the distinctiveness of their context and their culture. Now, actually, it shouldn't surprise us because often the West presented a monolithic image and outsiders saw it. For example, on the relationship, religion and politics. It was always that, well, in the West, we have separation of church and state. That wasn't true. It was the United States that had separation of church and state. For a good deal of England, you had a state religion. You had the state government often supporting the religious leaders and their institutions. Some of that has disappeared with the secularization. In the Muslim world, you can also see certain models in Japan and other places, but in the Muslim world, both now and in the future, we are going to continue to see that there will be multiple modernities. That yes, countries will borrow what they see as the best of examples, you know, from the West in virtually every area, but they'll also be responding to that in terms of their own culture. And that's what people want. Majorities of Muslims, however diverse, when asked, majorities of Muslims will say that they want the equivalent of democratization, but they will also say that their religion is important to them, both personally and in terms of culture and the public square. And so that will get expressed by significant and majority of Muslims that say in some way there should be a place for Sharia. What they mean by Sharia can be very different and diverse. What they tend to mean in general is that somehow religion is part of their moral compass. And if it's part of the moral compass, that religion will play an area on certain areas of, if you will, certain areas that of public policy, Muslim morality will prevail. We see that attitude in the United States, certainly from the conservative right, what was called the Christian right, on issues of representation, on issues of abortion, on issues of you name it. Especially became much more political when they realized if you want to have that sense of Christian values in the public square, you have to get involved in politics. That's when it emerged as a political force that wanted to put people in Congress and also put judges where they were. So part of the challenge then, okay, within America, or Western societies, is within a Western context to have a pluralism that people can live with. And we struggle with that in the U.S. increasingly between, if you will, the far right and other sectors of society. In the Muslim world, we will see the same thing. And two general observations here. But what we're going to see is populist movements, and I would say this is fairly common in the West and also in the Muslim world, populist movements in which either religion or secularism will be used by both governments and by people and people's groups and organizations. Okay. We see it again if you look at the politics of the Arab Spring, but also if you look at the ongoing politics, both before and after, in many Muslim countries, in Jordan, in Kuwait, etc., that you have Muslim parties running. And you have a significant number of voters that vote for it. In Turkey, we can think of a whole host of countries. We also see that people who do not support those parties will themselves still support, in a very, if you will, involved way and robust way, a religious dimension to the public square. But we also see others that want to see a totally secular future. In many countries, they are a minority, but they are a significant minority. We see governments that, whatever their orientation is, when convenient, appeal to religion. And we've seen that in the U.S., depending on the government. You know, some presidents appeal to religion more than others did. George W. Bush was seen as basically involving religion very much. And people saw that. And that's why, for example, when the U.S., went into Iraq successfully, you had missionaries who went to Iraq and went to Afghanistan right away, feeling that America and this president had opened up the way, as it were, for God to penetrate the society. And we see those debates occurring also in Western countries. France is a very good example. France is secular, but France has, from my point of view, a radical form of secularism. It has an allergy, is allergic to religion to begin with, and particularly to Islam. And of course, that's been compounded by the fact that ISIS has played its cards really very well. Because when you go in and you commit a terrorist act, you don't need a big army. You terrorize a society. But more importantly, that society then reacts the way some French people did in terms of what they demanded, the marches, etc. And that allows ISIS to say, see, they're passing laws that are going to restrict your civil liberties. That's the way they really are. Our challenge as citizens is as follows. Wherever we are in whatever country, I see in the near future a very dangerous road ahead. The dangerous road ahead is that we have societies in which significant percentages of people, politically and religiously, are not pluralistic and have become less pluralistic, both religiously and politically. But we forget that with globalization and multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies, we can't be exclusivist in our religion and our politics. We have to be inclusive. And being inclusive doesn't mean that you give up everything that you like. Being inclusive means that you accept the notion of diversity and accept the fact that while there can be, in exaggerated forms, diversity can be a problem, in fact, diversity can bring a richness to a society. Unless we do that, we will have political parties that do exactly what they do in Western countries, and we will have political parties or politics in Muslim countries that operate the way they do. It's not just a matter of Muslim countries, as you know, of secular versus Islamist parties. It's a matter of governments versus Islamist parties. And some governments portray a strong religious image. Others don't, but when it's convenient, they co-opt religion. You co-opt religion by doing what? You co-opt religion by the government taking such a great interest that it bankrolls, or as it were, it winds up paying the salaries of religious institutions and figures, and therefore it also makes their life easier. Why should you have to sweat over preparing a khutbah? Don't worry, we'll provide you with the sermon for this week. We're not only provided to you, but you're going to be expected to read it. Why should you have to bother about all those political parties? I remember the leader of one country saying that after he got into power, it was the king of Jordan, to be subtle about this, and he said first thing he had to do was economic development. But then they got to political development, for the sake of Jordan. And, there were so many parties in Jordan. And this is true. Again, what happens is, and that weakens the political process. When you have 20 parties, 40 parties, that happened after the Arab Spring. Okay? But in order to make it easier, what you really need to do, right, is you need to have fewer parties and have them be more representative. But to make it easy so that it won't be a headache and we can do it quickly, the government will do that. So the government will decide what parties can stay in and what parties are out. And then it also can then, in the future, pass on those parties. And not only on that, but you also do it with regard to civil society. In Egypt under Mubarak, you had an enormous civil society. But most of it was, as you know, civil society, you have NGOs, non-government organizations. In Egypt, it was government-regulated, non-government organizations. It had to approve your existence. It could take away your existence, or it could just say, gee, you're electing, quote, Islamically oriented people are now being elected, the head of the medical profession, the head of this profession, the head of that profession. So we're going to help in changing the rules in terms of how the elections move forward. In Western countries, there has to be a political and religious pluralism that basically says, we don't do what we've done. We've retreated to the old model. In the name of combating violent extremism, okay, democracies like the US and the UK, but you could say of a number of European countries, have, in the name of combating violent extremism, gone back to the old model, which is that, therefore, you support a stability, and the way to have it is security. Therefore, you go with an authoritarian regime, not realizing that you're creating a pressure cooker that can blow at any time, especially in societies where we now have this incredible youth bulge. I mean, that's part of the reason why you saw what happened in Tunisia and Egypt. Large numbers of people who however different they were, if they're young people, seeing, I've got no future. And you see it more clearly that you have none and that there are possibilities of changing it if you're able, through the internet, to see what's going on in the world and the discussions in the world. So I think this is a time when we need to move forward, and I think it is a time when we need to maybe remember what a common word between us and you wound up saying. A document signed by 300 major Muslim religious leaders and given to the leaders of the major Christian faiths, which basically said, we live in a globalized world, therefore we interface, and whether we like it or not, it's like with the environment. We live in a globalized world, and what they're doing in Indonesia affects Malaysia. And not only Indonesia and Malaysia, it winds up affecting the world, and the same thing with the US. And so what they basically said is, we need to work together, and we have a basis for it. What do we share in common, however different we are? Love of God, love of neighbor. Love of God, love of neighbor, right? But if you know your history, and if you know your religion correctly, in any of, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, or Jew, you know that the problem often in the past was the neighbor was somebody like me, relatively speaking, religiously, you see? So one has to realize that in a globalized world, and where you're now, again, multi-religious, we have to redefine our notion of the neighbor. It should be the easiest in Islam. Unfortunately, with the super right, it is not. The reason I say it should be the easiest is the Quran talks about and recognizes Jews and Christians as people of the book. God says, I could have created you many nations, created one. God says you should compete with each other, in terms of good. God recognizes in so many ways that phenomenon. And that becomes the challenge now. A healthy pluralism says, I may feel that religiously my way is the best way, but I recognize it's not the only way. I may feel that I have the fullness of truth or the final revelation, but I do recognize that revelation did come to Moses and Jesus, and that Christians and Jews can have a truth in that revelation. Westerners need to do the reverse. For Muslims, it should be a little easier, because for Muslims, you're the last of the communities, and therefore the Quran spoke to the previous. See? For the earlier ones, you were going this way. So Christians, of course, then said vis-a-vis Jews, there's a new covenant, New Testament, Old Testament, okay? But then Christians felt that's it. And they were not prepared, nor were Jews. There was nothing in their revelation that was talking about or envisioning, the emergence of that final revelation. Thank you. This is a question and answer period. So, okay, it's a question and answer, okay? As Leslie Gore sang, I won't sing it, it's my party, which means if you have a speech, if you have a big point, I suggest that you see the organizers and they may be able to schedule your lecture. Otherwise, other people don't get to talk. Somebody gets up. So don't say I have a question, but first I want to tell you about this and that. Try to do it as a question, because you're doing it in fairness to other people here in terms of the dynamic. It saves you the trouble of having to do that. Okay. Do you want to recognize? Right here we have. Yeah, and if you are recognized, would you go to a microphone so we can... Or you could just have them queue up at the microphone, whatever's easier. Oh, great, thank you. Is all right?
Okay. Malay. Yeah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Professor John Esposito.
Just call me John.
Yeah, it's okay. Anyway, granted that the rise of Islam everywhere, which has appeared on the radar screen of the West, has been placed in a bad light, as you put it. So what is your role in terms of throwing your weight, your influence on the American establishment, on the American elite foreign policymakers, in order that they not necessarily have that kind of jaundiced views or lopsided views of Islam? That is number one. And relatedly to that, I suppose about 20 years ago, when you embarked on that book, Islam in the 21st Century, that book and yourself has more or less fallen prey to the kind of Islamophobia arising from September 11. Correct me if I'm wrong. The book has been aborted and has to be rehashed in a new form, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, you finally published that book, but the original one was more or less rehashed in view of September 11, number one. Number two, you talk about...
you asked a question. Now you're not asking a question.
Yes, that's the first question.
If you did, you'd be asking two questions. I don't want to be impolite, but I can only do one at a time. You have people behind you.
Yeah.
Plus, I can't remember them.
This is not a question, but related to the first question also. Please. Well, in the first place, you also talk about multiple modernity and multiple, I'm going to add to that, multiple morality as well. That should be part of the constructive engagement that should have been pursued by the West, notably the United States of America.
Okay.
But what happened is that we have a trillion.
You said what
war.
happens there? Question, now I'll answer it.
No. You have the trillion.
No. I'm sorry. I'm the outsider. I'm also American, so you can just say it's a typical American attitude. It's brash, etc.
No. I'm just reinforcing my.
I cannot remember what you're saying. I'm not going to write everything down either. So I have to answer.
My first question
basically said. Okay.
So, but do you want me to come up with my second question after this?
No. We're going to just go from here. I think that it's important, and you know, one of the things I find kind of frustrating at times is that you have television here and you have internet, but in these situations, often people don't seem to see or be aware of the fact that what has happened with globalization and communication and globalization in general is that, in fact, for example, in Western societies, the world religions are taught in the school systems about these religions. Kids have a world history course, and they don't just history, they get into what the religions have to say. The media does cover religion. It may not cover it, you know, as often as it does. There are lots of books on it. For years, I would go to a bookstore, and all you would see would be maybe one book, maybe two on Islam. You'd have stacks of books on Judaism and Christianity. And then maybe you have a Quran or a sect. Now, there are all kinds of books that are out there, okay? I mean, if I've published as many books as you have you heard, think about the other people out there. There is coverage in the media. It may be not enough, but there's increasing coverage in the media. Look for a new program that was just broadcast in the U.S. National Geographic did a program called The Muslim Next Door, okay? For some reason, I have a link and it won't open here in Malaysia. So I don't know how you can do that. But I know the link works outside of Malaysia, certainly in other places. It may be whatever. But in fact, what I'm trying to say is our generation of students, when they go to school, have been exposed to world religions and world cultures. We also, many of the centers, actually provide free of charge a program for teachers. We provide books, we provide instruction, we provide lunch, etc. So in our society, there is that increase. The problem is it enough? Is the coverage enough? And is it at times distorted and affected, you know, by the fact that there are those who would try to shut that down? I think that what we do is this kind of work. I mean, many individuals and centers. Our project, bridge.georgetown.edu. If you go to that, you will see all kinds of information about anti-Muslim, anti-Islam attitudes and behaviors. You will see that we have over 1 million people who follow us on Facebook. So it's having a broader impact. You will see that we have fact sheets, not just articles about things, but we have a fact sheet on President Trump, a fact sheet on most of the people in his cabinet or his administration. We have a fact sheet on a variety of things, you know, other countries, of what goes on. All of that is there. We can talk privately about the other side. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the talk. I am Murat, PhD student in INSAFE. I have very short comment. I have very short comment and a related question. Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned about ISIS so many times.
Okay, but go ahead. No, I don't want to miss this. I can say it. Go ahead.
You mentioned about ISIS so many times, but I think there is one issue which is 100 times maybe more dangerous than ISIS in terms of relationship between West and Muslim world. The desire of the Western world to intervene and control Muslim world by coups, by invasions, by assassinations under the name of bringing democracy, peace, or by demonizing Muslims, or any means necessary. So this is also...
The question is...
Yeah, the question is, I mean, this is also creating terror organization, arming terror organization by US. So how we can stop this desire of Western world to control Muslim countries? I think this is causing greater damage than ISIS. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can appreciate that position, and I could accept a fair amount of it, but I would also note that what you leave out is that what brings people into the streets is not just the West. What brought people into the streets in Egypt and Tunisia was that they wanted to topple the government. They wanted to topple a government that was authoritarian. They wanted to topple a government that supported and was supported by not just business people, but corrupt business people, etc. So I think both factors come into play. The instability in countries comes from within and is influenced by from without. But it certainly comes from within, whether it's Egypt, Tunisia, or whatever. The healthiness of a society is affected primarily within, but affected significantly outside. I would love to see and believe that we need to move to, as it were, a new world order. And a new world order would be saying that if we believe in self-determination and human rights, then we have to stick to that and not suddenly say that in the name of combating violence and extremism, we're going to not only deal with the authoritarian governments that we dealt with in the past, but as has happened, we're getting even closer in our dealing with them. There are a number of countries in the West that have closer relationships with authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, and particularly in the Gulf. Okay, next.
Mr. Esposito, thank you for your insights.
Cannot hear you.
Thank you for your insights.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
1 second. Go ahead.
I want to thank you for your insights. Thank you very much. Can I just make a quick comment before I pose my question?
Yeah, if it's quick, I'm timing you.
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. I totally second your thoughts on the elephant in the room, which is the lack of pluralism, especially on a political level as well. And I think that's really important because the Muslims in the Muslim world and the West has to accept that the Muslim world, to a large extent, wants to democratize, but on its own turf and with its own colors. And I think this is one of the bigger elephants in the room. Another big elephant in the room is... Okay.
You get one elephant.
The question, one elephant. How about a giraffe? All right. The question is, I believe it was in your book on the Islamic threat, myth or reality, you mentioned that the way the West deals with Islam as a challenge or as a threat would either avert or precipitate an impending clash of civilizations. In your opinion now, after many years of writing the book, is the West dealing with Islam as a threat or as a challenge? Thank you.
Well, I think it's very clear that there is, first of all, there is a real reason for the West to fear Muslim extremism and terrorism. There is not a real reason for Western governments to give the impression by what is said by some political leaders, etc., that in fact they are attributing that to mainstream Islam. Okay, I think that in terms of clash of civilizations, part of the problem is that both sides have significant numbers in their population in the Muslim world in the West that in fact believe in a clash and believe that it's that it's there or it's going to happen. And in fact, it's precisely what groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS want to precipitate. So, then you wind up with, your more sometimes, if you will, aggressive politicians in the West and your aggressive people on the other side going at it. Okay, I think without getting into, for example, Sam Huntington's clash, and remember that a lot of the way we use clash differs sometimes from that because it's a generalization. But where Huntington, for example, I think where he, in the most obvious way where there's a mistake is when he said Islam has bloody borders. He didn't say Muslim countries have, or some Muslim countries have. And in fact, when he did his book, he kept it in. And we did a TV show together, and that was raised, and he did not back away from that. But I think we need to really realize that the rhetoric that occurs in media in the Muslim world at times, like the rhetoric that occurs if you're watching Fox TV or whatever, promotes not understanding and respect, but does promote the notion of an inevitable clash. Because it's like saying it's a black and white situation. Here we are, we're the model, we're the good guys. And there they are. And the they, too often, although not always, but too often, brush strokes. You can see it in the most obvious thing. When people, every time something happens, there are certain people who step forward and say, well, where are all the Muslim religious leaders denouncing it? When in fact, a lot of people do, and they don't know it because the media doesn't cover it because it's not that interesting. But still, the idea of raising that, that it's somehow the responsibility every time something goes wrong. We don't do the reverse, when Christian extremists do something. Yeah, I'm going to go back there because this gentleman's been standing there. Yeah.
Peace be upon you, Professor Esposito. I would like to ask the whole thing of these differences in understanding whether cultural or religion. Some of us believe that what is happening in the world has been fomented by certain people or certain global interests. Like, for example, the First World War. Some people believe that the First World War was created in order to bring down the Ottoman Empire, which was the main Islamic center of the world.
So your question is, is it,
okay, and let me just go to it. Just a minute.
Is there something?
Okay.
I just want to understand.
Okay, and then the Second World War. They say the Second World War
here.
was created in order so that the state of Israel might be created, and they say some people are planning a Third World War so that Israel can be center of one world government. And there are factors underlying all this, and these are what created the current condition where there is this suspicions against Muslims, all that. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I could not imagine teaching here, and I have taught here, if I had to deal with, my class would take all day to get to the, okay, so the question is, what is this being promoted, and are certain people promoting it? Again, I would say, it's being promoted in terms of what's happening today, in terms of the sense that the world is imploding, and particularly imploding, for example, in one part of the world, that the world's imploding in terms of, let's say, in the Middle East, okay? That's being promoted by insiders and supported at times and sustained by outsiders. But it comes from within the societies. So all one needs to really do is look at what's going on today. You have a Sunni-Shia rivalry that is declared and then played out by Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf countries vis-a-vis Iran and or Syria, etc. So I think that's what I'm trying to say. That, to put it another way, I often say that when I got into the fields 40 years ago, with Palestine and Israel, we were sure that there would be a resolution. And I felt sorry for academics who were specialists on Palestine and Israel and were retiring. I used to characterize them to scientists who spent their whole career working on a cure and then retiring and having a sense that, oh my God, there's no cure. Okay, 40 years later, Palestine and Israel today, all the key players inside, before you even get to the outsiders, who then support some of the key players, have made it an impossible and intractable situation. And I would say the same thing is true. If some Muslim countries and regimes have made it a dangerous situation, not just in their own countries, by the policies that they implement, but by the way they want to play it out internationally. And international players have got involved. You can take the example of Yemen. Okay, look at who the principal people fighting are, but then also look at those from outside that continue to be supportive. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your enlightening lecture. I'd like to ask about the economic dynamics of Muslim world and the West, and what it entails for the future of civilizational relationship. And
you have to get closer to the mic so I can. You want to ask about
the economic dynamics of the Muslim world and the West, and what it entails for the future civilizational relationships, given in the context of lopsided and hegemonic
Yeah,
dynamics
when you
it
said
had been.
the dynamic, what was the word before dynamic?
Economic.
Economic. Oh, I think economic factor. You see, that's an easy question to answer in terms of certain countries. So, for example, the president of my country has made it very clear that what is important is America first, and protecting America and its interests, and secondly, business. Constantly saying that. So, for example, when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia and came home, he emphasized that, and this is where there can be a problem, in effect, the policy taken by this administration, that is the current administration in the U.S., is that whatever you do in your country is your business. Okay? That means whatever a government does, in effect, it means whatever you're doing domestically, so you can be repressive, etc. It's not our business, it's your business, we're here. Okay. But where we can cooperate, and that's what his message in Saudi Arabia and in other places, we can cooperate combating violent extremism and preventing it, and we can cooperate in terms of business. And so he talked about the fact that they made a lot of business deals, that he brought business people over there. So I think economics plays a major force. I think economics also has always played a major force, obviously in the West, but also in the Muslim world. What do I mean by that? In almost any Muslim country I know, part of the corruption is the corporate sector. Not all the corporate sector, but very often a lot of your successful corporate people are locked in with the government, and they mutually support each other. After Morsi came to power and signaled that some of these corporations were going to be, looked at and prosecuted, a number of people fled the country. Sisi came in and invited them back. Clear signal. And you can look at, as I said, you can look at a variety of countries in the Muslim world, but you can also look at several countries in the West. Not all countries, but a number of them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful speech. Then my question is, what is your opinion about two conflicting narrative about civilization? First is equalizing or identifying religion with civilization, and taking civilization as the biggest analytical category for measuring the society or studying the society. Or on the other hand, talking about the multiple modernities is taught. So multiple civilizations, and even like Islam, Muslim world and the West. So within the Muslim world and the West, there are multiple of the civilizations, not a single civilization equivalent with the religion.
Okay. For me to answer that, what you have to do is give me that question in 2 or 3 sentences, brief. I had trouble following the whole thing. It's because the question is not crisp and clear.
No, the question is, there are two conflicting narratives about civilization. Civilization as equivalent with the religion. So perceiving civilization as the biggest analytical tool for studying the society. On the other hand, concept of multiple civilizations. For example, even within the Muslim world, there are not an Islamic civilization, multiple civilizations within the Islamic world.
Yeah, I don't believe that the word civilization is useful anymore. I think we've used it a lot, but it's a problem. For example, when Huntington talked about the problem of Chinese civilization, potentially, or Islamic civilization, okay? How could that, it implies that there's some sort of unity. Look at the politics of Egypt, Syria, and Libya in the 20th century. Look at Iran and Iraq. Where is there this unity? And what it does then, it feeds this notion when some say that Islam is the danger, that there's going to be, that Muslims are going to rise up with some kind of unity. The fact is, it's not there. One may talk about the ummah even religiously, but in terms of the political realities on the ground, it just simply isn't there. The same thing would be true when people say, Western civilization. Yes, there's some commonalities, but on the other hand, take a look at France and Germany. They fought 2 world wars against each other. So I think civilization is out. I also think that one has to be really careful when I think that religion is important, but the danger is that often when people talk about civilization, they make the predominant thing religion, as they do with politics. Then the problem becomes when you see terrorism, it becomes, the reason why we've got Al-Qaeda, the reason why we've got ISIS is religion. So all we really need to do is, for example, get religious leaders on board, get them to denounce, issue statements, etc. Religion is not the primary driver in most instances. Major studies on violence, major studies on suicide bombing, etc., is that usually the drivers are political. They have to do with issues of occupation very often, or a variety of political issues and sometimes economic issues, and then religion gets used to legitimate. The classic case of this is look at bin Laden's big interview on CNN. The first few pages is a almost classic critique that many in the Arab and Muslim world would identify of, if you will, the historic and present political ills, and injustices. And then he moves to religion to mobilize and recruit to fight back. Okay? All right. Closer to the mic.
My question is, when in 1999, when Samuel Huntington came with his book, The Clash of Civilization, there were so many outcries, so many people tried to crush him and saying that he just exaggerated. So some people rejected his idea and some people agreed with him. And they supposed that we should come up with a civilizational dialogue. Now, several years, several
So the question is,
do you think in your experience that this dialogue has resulted into the better world that we Muslim and the West have desired? That, and if I'm the only one person, can I add one question?
see, now I remember. If you go any longer, I'm going to forget it. I just forgot it. I was I was a member of Kofi Annan's putting together the Alliance of Civilizations, which was sponsored by Turkey and Spain. It was called a high-level group. There were about 17 of us. It included Archbishop Tutu, Sheikh Moza, foreign ministers or ex-foreign ministers, etc. Our purpose was to develop a document that was not only, if you will, theoretical, but practical, and made suggestions, okay? The idea was we don't want to have a document that simply says nice things and then gets put in the library. We want on the ground. Did that change things? No. I think it contributed to changing things and a lot of other things, common word, etc. But no, because to have change, it's not enough to have documents that come from political leaders or religious leaders. The change has to come, if they have a game plan, it has to still be implemented from below or come down from the top down. So it's not enough for religious leaders to say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is right. What religious leaders have to do is require that in the madrasas and the seminaries, in the schools, from when kids are young, that they are educated with the values for that change. Because all of that's going to get played out in a world which has political and economic forces that are going to be rushing against it. We live in a world. In the 1990s, Freedom House put out a report saying that democracy was growing, looking more and more robust, right? 2017, they put it out and said, we're in the worst situation that we've been in decades in terms of political liberties. 71 countries that are democracies, or claim to be, have backed away on a lot of the political liberties. And if you look at, again, the reality that I just said before, the assertion of post-Arab Spring out of fear of an even greater authoritarianism domestically in these countries, okay? More authoritarianism, but if they have oil wealth, also throwing money at it. Okay? The reinforcement and falling back on the relationship that Western powers support these kinds of governments and work with them because of the belief that this is the best way to combat violent extremism. And in fact, they get even more close, and et cetera. So I think that a lot of these projects do make a difference, but without it being a much more complex process, that's not going to happen. And also, in places like the UN and the EU, there's a significant division. There are those within both who really think that religion is the primary driver. And there are those who really realize that, no, it's political and socioeconomic issues, you know. So we've got to move more to get people more on board who are supposed to be suggesting the changes, and we've got to figure out a way to move more from below to put pressure on the governments. If governments remain authoritarian, it doesn't matter what the international community is saying. You know, here and then there. And then I think we have to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Professor. Do you consider Iranian revolution as a wise and successful movement?
No. I celebrated the Iranian Revolution when it occurred. That is, that I had real concerns and criticism about the Shah, and a concern that, in fact, here again, you know, I would say that in terms of image, okay, image in the outside world, the Shah, I would describe it as, the Shah was seen as, he and his wife would come to the States or other places, right? So they dressed like us. They sort of talked like us. They knew the language. It was different than when you would get some other people, let's say from the Gulf, who dressed differently, etc. And they would be on all the major TV shows. President Carter, just 6 months before the revolution, said that this was an island of stability. And you had all of those indices. People didn't realize that the Shah's government was what I would call authoritarianism light. It's like you have Coke and Coke Light. Okay, so you had authoritarianism, but it was light. It wasn't like the obvious heavy-handed of a Gaddafi, etc. And I saw the promise of that revolution because of the diversity of people who were behind it. But that quickly changed. You know, people like Barzaghan and many others were in and then out, and then I think it got co-opted. I think that I still think that Iran is a great country. I think it's got a lot of potential, but I think that it does not have a government that allows for real representation. Although I have to say, and a lot of Americans don't realize this in America, if you look at the parliament in Iran, it is far more interesting and complex than the parliament in many other Muslim countries. Okay? Yeah.
Professor,
this is a great moment. You are raising the last question.
Yeah.
I hope it's a good
last
one.
question and the central question to your conclusion. Professor, if we are going to any discussion with obsessed mind that whatever I know, whatever my truth is, I'm not going to change. So there is no conclusion of that discussion. Given this, you conclude that the conflict solution of West and Islam is the part that you have to accept that you have your own truth. But you have to also accept that this is not the only truth, but the other one has also a truth. If we are considering this, that we are not going to change that objective truth, so where we are heading at the end?
Okay, you're misunderstanding. Okay, number one, it's not that things aren't going to change and they can change. I'm saying right now, the forces in society unexpectedly, okay, have swung a significant minority, not the majority, but a significant minority in the West and in the Muslim world have swung to a more far-right position, okay, and a far less pluralistic position. I'm also saying that when it comes to religious pluralism, okay, that if you are religiously pluralistic, it doesn't mean that you deny anything, you know, that you see as the heart of your religion. What it does mean is that you are open to the fact that you don't have a lock on the only truth or truths that exist, that in fact, truth can be found in other religious traditions, that there's a diversity there. And without that understanding, you can't go forward. And what I'm saying in a Muslim context is that it's very, from my point of view, easy and clear to say in a Muslim context that the Quran says it, okay? That the Quran recognizes the biblical prophets. It recognizes the revelation to Moses and Jesus. It may think that parts of the Injil, they may think that parts of the Torah became distorted historically, but it doesn't say that all of that's gone. The Quran recognizes the diversity of those religious traditions, and that has to be seen. I would also say that in many Muslim societies or communities in the West and here, there is an element that still fails to understand that. And I'll give you a graphic example of this. This may not mean anything. In the center that we created, we have different artwork, etc. Sayyid Hussein Nasser, a very prominent Muslim scholar, gave me a wood carving that was done by somebody who admired him. And that wood carving has Miriam, okay, and he has Jesus and Mary. And it has the quote from the Quran that's relevant. Okay? And he gave it to me because the person gave it to him. It was something that showed that kind of bridging, bringing that out, that the Quran, talks about. I mean, I find it fascinating that Jesus is mentioned more in the Quran than Muhammad is, that Mary's mentioned more in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. But in any case, we had a situation where we had a group of students coming from a Muslim school, and it happened to be a Saudi Muslim school, which in many ways could be very good educationally, and we had students come regularly. But one time, a particular teacher came, and one of the first things she did is, in front of the students, denounce that and turn to my staff and say, that has to be taken down. That mentality is a dead end. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Professor Esposito, for your insightful speech and for taking the time to respond to the questions from the floor. We look forward to more sessions with you, inshallah, in the future. Please do not wait 10 more years to come back and visit us. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we have earlier heard Her Excellency Dr. Merva spoke at length about Professor Esposito, his accomplishments and contributions to the Muslims. Professor Esposito is indeed a man who has built bridges atop deep chasms between Islam and the Western world through continuous and meaningful dialogue, research, and wisdom. Hence, the International Islamic University Malaysia is honored and proud to present the Lifetime Outstanding Achievement Award to Professor Dr. John Luis Esposito. May I invite Professor Dr. Sri Dr. Zaleha, accompanied by Professor Abdul Aziz, to present the Lifetime Outstanding Achievement Award to Professor Dr. John Luis Esposito. Professor Zaleha will now present a memento to Professor Esposito to remember us by. Thank you, Dr. Sri, and thank you, Professor Esposito. Our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Esposito. It's indeed an award well deserved. I have now the distinct honor and privilege to invite Professor Esposito to deliver his acceptance speech.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very honored, and this award belongs to my parents. It belongs to Ismail Al-Faruqi, and it belongs to my wife. Thank you.
Right. With that short acceptance speech from Professor Esposito, we have come to the end of this event. Thank you once again, Professor Esposito, for being with us today. We hope you will enjoy the rest of your stay in Malaysia. And thank you all for coming. Our work does not end here. We all need to continue working together as we face the many challenges of today. We need to learn from each other and understand each other. For this reason, ISTAC will continue to organize lectures such as this wonderful one today in the future. We look forward to your participation in our future events. Having said this, I would like to end this session with Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May I now invite the guest of honor, rector and also the deputy rector to join the participants for a photography session. Can I get all of you to stand up, please? Thank you.